Good morning. So yeah, it is so much warmer here, and I absolutely love coming back to Louisiana. It's actually, my husband and I were saying, it's one of the only places that we can authentically be Catholic too. So thank you for allowing us to be able to do that. We navigated almost a foot of snow yesterday to get out, and like I said, we're very excited to be here. You know, I always start with, if I can do this the right way, we talked about this earlier, right? We have more people today enslaved, nearly 48.5 million people, than any other point in time in history combined. And so I start with these numbers because that's something that we need to think about. I mean, we sit here and we talk about who are we looking for? Who is being held? Who are some of the people, maybe I'll go up a little bit higher. Who are some of the people that we need to find? And so for me, it's about really educating on understanding where we're finding these vulnerable people and what they're looking for. You know, typically we've always talked about who in here is familiar with commercial trafficking. And we understand that, right? Like, we know that nearly 90% of commercially trafficked kids come out of the foster care system within the United States. Are you guys aware that when we're talking about children in the US, that 83% of them are United States citizens? They were born here, they were raised here. I travel all over, and it's interesting because people will say, well, gosh, if we put barriers up, or if we don't allow people to come into our country, then we'll stop trafficking. If we want to build a wall around the entire United States, we can probably think about doing that, but then we've got to look inside. We have to look at actually what's going on, what we're contributing to. And one of the things I always say as Catholics, who are we responsible for? We are here to care for each other. We are here to be stewards of each other. And if we're not understanding where we're coming from on there, then we're missing the point across the board. When we talk about familial trafficking, I always say to people, would you know if it was standing in front of you? Would you know a victim when they were there? And a lot of times, it's not because our systems, we don't want to see what's happening, we don't know how to see it. How many in here could clearly identify a victim standing in front of you? Take me out of the equation, but anybody else? Look around, guys. No hands up. So this is why we're here, and this is why it is so important that we not only talk about how do we educate on this, how do we create awareness, but also how do we see what is clearly standing in front of us. When you do a Google search, the top 3 pages that come up on Google, this is why we don't know what we're looking for. You guys, this is not what human trafficking looks like in the United States. I want to tell you this. When I speak all over, people are like, oh, it's like Taken. Were you kidnapped? Were you held in a box? What really happened? And I was like, none of that. I went to Catholic school every day. I was one of the top soccer players in the state of Colorado. I had a full ride scholarship to play soccer. When I went to college. It wasn't this. And this is what I want to talk about. This is the piece of the awareness that a lot of victims, they're standing in front of you, they're in your parishes. They play with your kids. And so this is what we need to talk about. This isn't the reality of it. Kidnapping is about less than 3% of our actual victims in the United States. So when we talk about and we use sensationalized photographs, and we look at kids in chains, women in chains, people roped up, kids in cages. That's not what we're talking about. And so those 2 photographs, the slide before that and this, are the only times that you're going to see sensationalized photos within any of the presentations that I do, because I want to really hit home on this is not what it looks like, and this is why we're not seeing it. This is the face of a child who's been trafficked. I was 2.5 years old in this picture. I had already been trafficked for about a year before that. This is why we're not seeing. This is a little girl who went to Notre Dame Catholic school every day. This is a little girl who sat in front of her parochial school teacher and couldn't sit because of the trauma she had. And instead of the teacher coming up and saying, what is happening, what's going on, the teacher put me on timeout. I was ostracized because they didn't know how to handle what was happening, and she didn't know how to see it. And I stand up now and people say, aren't you angry at the people that missed you? Aren't you angry with all of the things that there are people that could have stopped this? And I have to look back on my life and say, you know what, again, going back to, they didn't know what they were looking for. They didn't, besides the fact that we moved schools around a little bit, nobody knew what they were looking for. I was in Catholic school and in public school. By the time we finally moved, you guys, I grew up in a very affluent mountain community in Colorado, lived in a $500,000 home. Nobody questioned what was happening or what was going on. So a little bit about my story. I don't usually give a lot of details unless it pertains to, educating and really helping people to understand, but there are times when it's important to talk about those details. I really appreciate when Debbie said, we don't want to just bring speakers up, because I'll tell you, one of the things my organization has done is we've had to walk beside speakers who have been re-exploited and brought up on stage, and they're made to tell their story, and they're not healed. They're not in a situation that is healthy for them to do that. And that's the greatest thing too. When you have an organization, if you're working with victims, really understand where they are in their healing, because if you're not walking with them and you're not understanding where they're coming from, then you could be contributing to re-exploitation of them. And this includes also offering them compensation, because they are the lived experts in that area. And so, a lot of times early on, I would get invited to tables, and it would be, everybody else would be sitting there, even governor's councils. Everyone else would sit there, and they would be there being represented by their organizations. They would get paid to be there. Do you know, I would sit at the table with survivors, and they were struggling to even get there to eat. But they were trying to show up because they wanted to be a voice. When I was younger, we didn't have the term human trafficking. Do you guys know that the TVPA, the federal TVPA law in 2000 was first introduced? That's really the first time that we actually talked about what is human trafficking in the United States. 20 years ago. It hasn't been that long. And so a lot of us, years before that, there were different classifications. It was child abuse, it was incest, it was endangering a child. We didn't really talk about what was going on. My abuse started for me at the age of 1 year old and continued until I was 14 years old. So as I said, I was in school every day. School was safe for me. Playing sports was safe for me. But I learned to live two different lives. I learned to protect my mom and my brother. And here's the thing too, is that when adults tell a child something, when you're a child and an adult tells you something, you believe that, because that adult is smart and those adults know what they're talking about. When your parent or blood relative tells you something, that's word. And so as a child, you don't think that there's anything else besides that. So, from the earliest ages, I was told, God made you for this. God made you to serve me. Everybody knows what's happening to you. Your family knows. Your mom knows. Her entire family knows, but guess what? We don't talk about this. If we talk about it, somebody's going to get hurt. And in my case, it was knowing that my brother or my mom would get hurt. So I didn't talk about it. For years, I sat there, and here's the funny thing is my mom ended up divorcing my biological father when I was 5. He actually tried to kill her. He went to prison for a few months, and when he came out, he actually ended up getting partial custody of my brother and I. Because a lot of state laws, even back then, and we're working on them now nationally, if the abuse wasn't directly on the children, but on the parent, they still allowed the perpetrator to see the children. And so again, it's really recognizing when are kids in danger? And if the mother's in danger, then sure enough, the children are probably going to be in danger too. And I go into states now where they're like, we don't separate that. We still, if the abuse wasn't directly on the kids, then they still get partial custody. That's what happened with me. So my mom actually became a police officer when I was 7 years old, because she was like, if I'm ever going to be held in a situation again where we are held hostage, where I have a gun held to my head, then you know what? I want to know how to protect my family. So while my mom was a police officer, I was being trafficked on the weekends that I had to visit my biological father. When I was 13 years old, I remember sitting in health class. And again, in my entire life, everything that I knew about myself was that this is what every little girl does every time. This is how you survive. My grandma probably had to do it. My aunts probably had to do it. So if they had to do it, I can endure it too. here's the other thing I was told, and I thought from the earliest ages that I was so brave because I was enduring whatever my biological father wanted to subject me to, whatever men he wanted to subject me to. But you know what? Another little girl wasn't going to get hurt. And I believed that in the core of who I was. And so I stayed quiet. And I said, okay, this is what God put me here for. Maybe I'm here to save another child. So sitting there in health class, and I remember, our teacher, we're talking about things like rape and incest and the validity of saying no and owning your body and having that power. And I remember being like, oh man, this is going to get really awkward because we don't talk about this. And I remember looking around at all my girlfriends in the class, friends that I had known for years, and I was like, oh, this is going to be really bad. The teacher doesn't know what she's doing. And we're sitting there, and she brought up the topic of incest. And I remember looking at my best friend, who I had known for several years, and I looked at her face, and she was like, who does that? Whose parent forces them to do that? And I'm looking around at the rest of the class, and they're like, this is disgusting. Parents don't do this to their kids. Like, adults don't do this to kids. Why do we even have to talk about this? And in that moment where I thought I was part of the entire world, I was alone in my own world. So I went home that afternoon, and we didn't have Google back then, and so I tried to take my life. I have a really incredible scar going way down the side of my wrist over here because I was 13. I didn't know what I was doing. But that sort of set off a chain of events, but again, nobody knew what to do. So my mom, being a police officer, the first thing that she did was she was going to confront my biological father. But guess what? I wasn't telling them that he was actually the perpetrator. It was his friends. It was people he'd subjected me to, because in my mind, I still love that man. I would have done anything to make sure that he loved me, to prove to him that I was worthy of his love. So my mom thought it was his friend, and so she went and she showed up in her police uniform, and she threatened him and said, if I find out you've ever touched my daughter, then there's going to be trouble. And that was the end of it. Well, that was, towards summer, into summer, fall. That Christmas, my brother and I had to go visit with him for a week over Christmas break. And I remember waking up to him straddling me with a cord around my neck, saying, if you tell on me at all, you will die. I will kill your brother, I will kill your mom. None of you will survive. But the only thing in that moment that I could think of was the fact that earlier that day, he had introduced my brother and I to his new fiance, who was a professional dancer herself, so a lot of trauma going on. She had 2 little girls, 2 and 4 years old. And I knew at that moment that I had to say something because I could not protect them anymore. And I recognized that there was probably going to be abuse that happened with them. So I went home and I actually talked to a counselor and ended up bringing in several counties. The state of Colorado ended up bringing 27 counts against my biological father. Counts like child abuse, subjecting a child to abuse, a lot of different things. He ended up hiring the best attorney in the state. Again, the awareness wasn't even there around our judges. It wasn't even there around law enforcement. At this point, I'm almost 14. A 14-year-old girl should not have to sit laying naked on a hospital table and be subjected to being looked at over and over and over. So when I educate medical professionals now, I tell them, please, have one person on your staff be that contact person. Because I can tell you what, as a survivor, I can size any one of you up in this room in about 5.2 seconds. And if I don't trust you, I am not going to talk, and I'm going to continue to build a wall around me. So when you bring people in over and over and ask me the same questions, and you want to look at all of my scars and you want to examine me, you're not going to have cooperation from me. And so we went to trial. The night before we were actually, it was a long process, again, for a 14-year-old. The night before we actually went to trial, and this dragged on a year. At that point, the kids in my school, it was a huge scandal. Everybody knew Kelly was the abused girl. And I'll tell you what, I had friends who weren't allowed to hang out with me anymore because their parents were afraid that I would teach their daughters to be prostitutes. And so it's that education piece, right? And so I had guys at school, like my own peers, all of a sudden took interest in me. because they thought that I was loose. They thought that I was going to be able to do things with them that no other girls would do. All of these rumors, everything swirled, and I knew I stayed with it because I was like, I have to stand up for these two little girls. We show up to court, and my biological father's there with his fiance. She was there the entire time. They read through all the charges, everything. The night before we go to trial, he decides to plead guilty. 19 counts. I don't know about any one of you guys, but if I did anything to a child at all and I was innocent of it, who in here would plead guilty to 1 count? 19. I had a female judge. She actually just retired as a Supreme Court judge in the state of Colorado. When I stood up there to read my testimony, I remember standing there and I'm shaking and I could barely get through it. She's flipping through papers on her desk. She didn't even pick up her head to look at me. She didn't even acknowledge me. And at the same time, my biological father is sitting right in front of me, just smiling at me the entire time. So, read through it. She takes a break. She comes back. She sentenced him to 2 months in jail. And he had time served, so he had been there for 6 months before that. He served 8 months total. He didn't have to register as a sex offender. He didn't have to pay restitution. And so from that, and he walked out hand in hand with his fiance, and they got married. So for me, the only good thing that came out of that is that he lost his right to be my father. And so, and again, it's that awareness piece. And, my family, my mom's family was an incredible family. We struggle now because there were signs in the families recognizing the abuse, they're recognizing things that they missed. But I'll tell you what, they didn't know how to handle this trauma. And I started recognizing pretty much every single female in my entire family had some sort of trauma that happened to them. So as soon as that court date was over, my mom and stepdad were like, okay, let's go out and get some ice cream. We're done. This is good. Let's move on with our lives. It doesn't really work that way. So I graduated high school. I sort of put everything into it. I went to college. I became a social worker because hurt people want to figure out how to heal other people. Probably not the best idea. And a lot of times I say this, I joke around with a lot of my friends who are therapists all the time, and they're like, I said, why did you go into this? And they're like, well, I wanted to help people. And when you go back into it, a lot of it was because of their own trauma. And they wanted to figure out how to help themselves. And so there are some really good ones that came out of it. I found that I wasn't a very good one because I was taking everything internally and every child that I was seeing. And so I actually became a social worker to prevent child sex crimes. Again, not a good combo for a 22-year-old girl coming out of college who had never gone to therapy after any of her abuse. So, but I had to learn to live a dual life, right? Because my family, nobody wanted to talk about it. It was almost like that was our past. Let's not shame the family. Let's not talk about any of this stuff. And the whole family was like that, which has led to some long-term trauma, but we're healing from it. The one thing I want to always point out, and I told that story about being on the table. You guys, I've had to have 3 different reconstructive surgeries of my reproductive area from the trauma that I've had when I was younger. So people, that it was there. But, I always hear this from victims, right? Like the victim will say I was abused, and so what do we say? Oh, let's take thousands of photographs, let's interview her 1,000,000 times, let's take a lot of videos. And someone like my biological father was like, I didn't do it. I would never do it. And everyone was like, okay, well, that was my experience in court. So I felt like, I thought I had a voice, but I really didn't. So what was I going to do? I started recognizing too, and this is an incredible number, 15% of victims in the United States are under the age of 12. We know commercially, right, that around the age of 12, 13 is the average age of a commercial survivor that gets involved into trafficking, whether or not it's a family situation, they're in foster care, they've run away. Do you guys know what the age of average age of a familially trafficked survivor is? 5 years old. And because of that, nearly 75% of kids we don't tell. We're not going to tell people of our abuse because here's the biggest thing. To me as a child, all of you guys knew that I was being abused, and so why would I come to you and tell you? Because you are going to turn around and go right back to my perpetrator. And in a lot of times when we are not educated with what we're doing and how to culturally and sensitively meet the needs of the survivor and meet them where they are, then this is what happens, because we make mistakes. We don't know how to connect with them. And so now that survivor, you've just shown them exactly what their perpetrator has said to them all along. Again, going back to, I don't want to do a lot of facts on human trafficking because we're going to hear about that today. For me, one of the greatest things that I actually enjoy speaking on a lot more than just talking about my story and talking about facts. I could spew data in my sleep. But I really want to talk about the essence of forgiveness, because this is where I find the hardest part for survivors. This is where I find the hardest part in their healing. And I know for me, you guys, I'm not perfect. Certainly my husband's sitting here. You can absolutely ask him. There are times I think he would give me back if he could. But, and I'm not normal all the time. Ask my kids. I'm crazy as heck sometimes, but it depends on the situation. But I've had to recognize through my life that in order to move on, in order to cultivate relationships and actually build up trust, I've had to turn around and figure out how to forgive those. And that's the hardest thing to do. I'll tell you what, and I stand up here and I say, it's not, I don't ever want to say I'm fully healed, because I'm not. And I will relapse, and I will have days where I'm like, I'm not getting out of bed. I can't, I physically and mentally, emotionally cannot handle this. And you know what? That's okay. But the biggest pieces that I'm working on is trying to figure out, how do I let go of all of this? And that's the relationship. People ask me, they're like, how are you not angry? How are you not angry with God? Where was God when you were little? I ask myself that a lot. So one of when I was little, I used to have an imaginary friend. His name was Cody. Cody looked like a horse, or he was a horse that looked like a giraffe. Because that was the most normal thing that was happening in my life. Cody would come in and talk to me. He had a male voice. Sometimes Cody would come in and show me things. Sometimes when I was being abused, a lot of times in therapy, victims will tell their therapists, I don't remember everything that happened in that one particular moment, especially during an attack, because I wasn't in my body. Is there anybody in here that's ever heard that before? They weren't there. So whether or not they dissociated, I'm going to tell you, from the earliest ages of about 2 years old, Cody would come and take me out of my body. And he would take me to incredible places, and I didn't feel what was happening to me. I could absolutely see it. I could look down and I could see the little girl laying there, but I couldn't feel it. When I came back into my body when it was over, I could absolutely feel that. So, I had Cody throughout my life, but as I got older, I recognized, it's not okay to talk to imaginary people, right? We shouldn't, people think you're crazy. People already think I'm crazy. Especially when I'm trying to dually navigate through the abuse that I had. I wasn't always truthful with everything in my life, because again, we learned, I wanted people to think that I was living a normal life. My biological father was incredible. We did amazing things together. That wasn't the reality of it. And sometimes I would embellish so much that people were like, your stories aren't matching. And I think that, and when I talk to survivors now, I think that's one of the greatest reasons I was missed too, because I was dubbed as somebody who wasn't fully telling the truth, or it didn't make sense. None of it was making sense to me. My life wasn't making sense to me. And I certainly didn't know where God was in this, but I knew that I was seeing signs of it in other places. One of the most incredible things that I always say to people, though, is every time Cody would come in, I would smell roses. The most incredible smell of roses all over. And so, but by the time I was about the age of 12, I recognized that it's not okay to talk to imaginary horse giraffes that don't exist. And so, didn't really see Cody much. Fast forward until I was about 22 years old, and I'm pregnant with my first child, and it was an unplanned pregnancy. Actually, none of my children have really been planned, but here they all are, right? And so but I'd had situations in my life where at the age of 2, at the age of 11, at the age of 22, and at the age of 33, where I knew that I left my body. And I knew that if somebody didn't come in, so whether or not it was medical at the time, it was from a back surgery. When I was 22, I'm 5 months pregnant and I get appendicitis. I had gangrene in me for 3.5 days. And I was in and out of consciousness, and they were about to take the baby because they didn't know, again, this is back in 2000, they couldn't do an ultrasound, or they couldn't do an x-ray because I'm pregnant. But the doctor was like, something's not right with her. Her blood count is way off the charts. Let's do something. So I remember being in and out of consciousness, and they called my mom, and they said, what do you want to do? The baby's not at the age of viability. I didn't know what I was having at that point. And they said, we need to open her up, but chances are we're going to lose this baby. So I remember laying there, and I couldn't speak, and I was like, please, please, don't take my baby, don't take my baby. But my mom chose to save me. And so they're wheeling me into the operating room, and I can't wake up. I can hear everything that's going on around me. I can't wake up to tell them. And at that moment, I can feel myself leaving again, and I was like, oh no, here we go. And there's Cody. And I stood up, and I walked towards him in a room, and everything, it was like effervescent around me. Stood up, and I was like, Cody, I haven't seen you. And Cody started walking to me, but Cody morphed into a man. And I remember looking at him, and I looked in his eyes, and I said, I don't know why I said it, and I said, you're St. Michael. And he looked at me, and he was carrying a baby, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby. You guys look, I don't look anything like that. And he said, this is Andrew, you're gonna be okay. And I looked at him and I said, Cody, you're a man. And he said, if I would have come to you as a child in the form that I am in now, would you have ever come with me? No, because I wouldn't have trusted him. So he had to come in a form that was okay for me to trust and accept. So I remember just looking at him, and I wanted to stay. I wanted to stay in this place, and it was the most incredible. There were smells, colors, sights, sound, and with Cody, and he handed me Andrew, and there's roses everywhere, and it felt like I was just enveloped in the most incredible sense of love that I had ever felt in my life. And I knew that I was going to fight, because this life here was one that I had to honor. And I always have told people this, if my biological father had recognized, and I speak it right to life, dinners all over the country, if my biological father had one time recognized the dignity and divinity within himself, he would have seen it in me. He would have seen the dignity that I had, and he would have given me a value and a worth. I was a throwaway child. And I think that's part of the problem with our culture now, right? That's part of the problem with our society, is we get to pick and choose who's worthy. We get to pick and choose who is valuable of being here on this earth, who gets to breathe this air, who we give resources to. This is why there are kids like me, because adults who are broken don't understand it, and they were never nurtured enough to see it and to know what love is within themselves. And I knew at that moment that I had to fight for this little boy. I couldn't fight for the little girls that my biological father was with. I couldn't fight for other kids throughout my life, but I had to fight for him. And one of the biggest things, that I will always take away from that experience, and I remember him, when I handed Andrew back, and he said, you're gonna go back now, you're gonna be fine. And I came back, and I remember the last thing he said was, there's only two things you need to know in this life: how to love and how to forgive. And that's all you need to do. And I'll tell you what, guys, to this day, I still struggle doing it, because there are some people I truly feel like need a high five in the face when I see them. I restrain from doing it because I don't look good in orange. But other than that, how do we balance that, right? How do we walk through life and forgive people, especially those who've damaged us the most? The biggest thing, let me know how I'm doing on time as well too, but one of the biggest things that I've always said is forgiveness is a responsibility. And this is where I talk about, especially as Catholics, right? We sit there and we talk about having free will. What does free will mean? And when I work with my survivors, I sit there and I'm like, you have free will now. You get to choose which path you want to take. You're not. The person who is back here, that's not your story. Your story is who you want to become. We're not defined by our past. We're not defined by the things that have happened to us, and especially in moments when we didn't have free will. But with free will, now that we have taken power back with that, we have a great responsibility for that, because now we have to choose. Do we forgive? Do we heal? Do we stay angry? Do we move on? And you know what? I experience those emotions all the time. It doesn't ever go away, and that still is okay. The thing is that I always have to continually remind myself that I have to continually check in with myself and say, you know what, this is your free will, you get to choose. Claim your power, because you didn't get that as a little kid. I'm taking that back now as an adult. Am I doing the right way? So, here's some other crazy tidbits of me, right? I continue to move on. This girl in the picture here was Miss Teen Colorado. Who would have thought that the little girl at 15 years old who was standing there trembling, could barely testify, would represent her community at some point? Moving on, all of the different things. I don't know if any of you guys have seen the movie Ladybugs. I got to be in that. So many different things in my life, so many opportunities, but I had to choose to take them and not sit back in my victimhood. I had to sit there and say, I want to survive through this. Right here, guys, this man right here. It's really been the last couple years that we have talked about what's happened within our marriage. We've been together 20 years now. What has happened within our marriage? How do we navigate through this? I wasn't communicating with him early on. And we made a lot of mistakes in our marriage, but we also have learned, one of the things that he told me early on, I don't understand you. I don't know where you came from. All I know is that I'm here to love you. And this is what I say to my survivors too. Find that man that's willing to meet you where you are and walk with you. The other piece here, we're not called to be perfect, right? We're called to work towards being saints here on earth, but we're not called to be perfect every single day. That's a lot of stress, and I think a lot more of us would be in AA if we had to completely follow that. But we're called to what? To just stand up and speak our truth, to live our truth and be valid there. This point in I remember seeing these articles. So my husband was elected in the state of Colorado, and then I was newly elected. If you guys really want to have good, healthy marriages, don't do that. Because you will serve everybody else, and sometimes you forget to serve at home. And you forget to come back home and what's really important. So we had 4 kids. Our kids were doing parades. My daughter, at the age of 5 years old, all she knew when we would wave at people is she was doing the Princess Diana wave. And I was like, when we recognized it, I was like, oh my gosh, that's all they know is being in front of people. And we sort of, for a while, lost where our family was. We sort of lost having that relationship. And part of it is because within my own trauma, I wasn't communicating. I didn't know how to communicate, and my husband didn't know how to ask. He didn't know how to say, where are we? How do we meet through this? We've come out of this, but I always show this because everybody's like, you guys must have been on top of the world at that point. This was one of the lowest points when I look back in our marriage, because we were trying to serve and we thought we were doing right for everybody else, and we forgot where we were at home. And that's part of, again, recognizing and healing and coming back to it. And and my husband, he probably doesn't ever want me to point him out in some things, but especially within our faith, that man right there, he's my Joseph. And he has brought me to a place of understanding and recognizing that, God wasn't wrong in everything that he's done growing up, and he wasn't wrong in bringing us together. I didn't know how to see it. And so now that I stand here and I'm asking people to how do you see human trafficking victims, right, when they're in front of you? I have to say, too, how do you see God? What is your relationship like with him? And recognizing how welcoming are you to have, our Savior come into your life, or his most blessed mother? Are we always going to be open to that? Because I'll tell you, sometimes they want to hit us on the head with a 2x4 in what we're doing. And we have to learn to surrender. And that's the greatest thing that I've learned, especially within our relationship, is how do we surrender together? And how do we make that work? I also look back too. I told at least 7 people in my life, 7 adults, that through the age of kindergarten until I was in 8th grade, what was happening to me. Again, they didn't know what they were looking for. Debbie sort of touched on it, but the professions that are most likely to be in contact with child trafficking victims, medical professionals and educators. One of the other things I do is actually, we do education with medical professionals. A few years ago, we did a study of survivors, and we asked them, we wanted to figure out where they were being missed in the medical profession. This is what we came up with. The 2 greatest areas that survivors are being missed is emergency room care because they don't know what they're seeing when it comes in. They're not properly separating the victims from their traffickers, especially if it's a family situation. But look at this 42% here. Our abortion clinics in the United States are actively not reporting minors coming in when they are pregnant, when they are seeking services. And when the question we asked was, how many times have you been there? This answer is at least 2 or more times. This is what we need to change in our culture. And for me, it's not a women's rights issue. Absolutely. This is a human rights issue. And we have to make them recognize that even though they think they're providing a service, they're actually aiding and they're supporting traffickers. Traffickers know that Planned Parenthood is the #1 clinic in the nation they can go to get free birth control and for their victims. Absolutely. Who's paying for that, you guys? This, I won't go through this, but this is a guide that I actually wrote for Shared Hope International, so I know it, I think it's back here somewhere, but this is to help people recognize the familial trafficking signs, because again, we're not the same. So, recognizing what's in front of you, who they are. At the end of the day, like I said, the greatest thing that we need to do in our jobs with working with trafficking victims is we need to meet them where they are. And a lot of times, a lot of professionals will say, I have a victim, but she won't talk to me, she won't work with me. And I'm like, well, are you meeting her where she is or where he is? Here's another thing too, and I know we're gonna have a speaker up on this this a little bit later. Do you know what the percentage of victims who are boys in the United States are now? Almost 50%. We talk about girls all the time. All we're looking for is girls, girls, girls. Boys are a huge, significant number of victims in the United States too. And what happens, those boys, they grow up to be men. Do you know what the difference between a child and an adult is who have been abused and working with their trauma? About 60 seconds. And so recognizing that damaged children are going to grow up to be damaged adults, but we have to learn to come and meet them where they are. Here's the other thing I always like to end with too. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. And so part of my job when I speak to legislatures, I cannot tell you how many times I sit there and I testify and they'll say, well, what about this child who's acting as a prostitute? What about this child? You know what? Federally, we defined that 20 years ago. So any child under the age of 18 cannot consent to sex. There's no such thing. And if they are doing survival sex or they're forced to do it, here's the other thing too, you guys, not all pimps are people. Do you want to know what the greatest root cause of sexual exploitation in the United States is or around the world is? Poverty. People who are in poverty, with the absence of choice, you have no options. And this is what we need to recognize. And so when we're walking with somebody who's broken, guys, we drove by the bridge today. When I come out here, I will walk at night, and much to my husband's chagrin, but I will walk and just meet the women under the bridge. Talk to them, find out where they are, because I can guarantee you most of them, had they been given the right path, they'd be standing here on this stage. They wouldn't be living there. And so recognizing the root cause of their trauma, recognizing where they are. I was very blessed to be able to gain a sense of normalcy coming back. Look at my family. It's such an incredible blessing, but it's also a work in progress. And my job isn't just to make saints of these 4 people right here. 3 of them we're doing better on than we are with one of them, because he definitely got my will to be stubborn. But they're incredible, incredible kids. But I'm not called to just make them saints. I am called to make them aware of the people around them who can't fight for themselves. And I think that's what I want to leave with today, and that's what we're asking you guys to do today. Be the voice for somebody who can't fight for themselves, but recognize whose voice you're speaking for. Because until we can do that, we're not going to change the culture at all, and we're not going to end or even begin to eradicate modern-day slavery as we know it in the United States. So, again, I will be here and can definitely take questions later, but thank you for being here and your willingness to want to hear some really hard things today. Because sometimes in order for us to heal and move on, we have to work through the hard topics, right? We have to have those hard conversations. And that means for us as Catholics, it means talking from protecting the dignity of life from birth to death, everything that's in between, and recognizing it. So as long as we can do that, then we're doing all we can. Thank you so much.